welcome once more to the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. Next week, on May 10th, our speaker will be Eric Alden Smith from University of Washington Department of Anthropology, and his talk will be on large-scale cooperation in small-scale societies. This week, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ed Slingerland from UBC, University of British Columbia, Department of Asian Studies, and the Canada Research Chair in Chinese Thought and Embodied Cognition. And also the co-director of the Human Evolution, Cognition, and Culture program? HEC, at UBC. So Ted will be talking today about why humanists hate vertical integration.
Not humans in general. Subset of humans. Okay.
Welcome.
All right, so I didn't know what sort of crowd I was going to get, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my most recent book project, which some of my colleagues here know me from my day job as a Chinese philosophy person, but I've branched out into more abstract things. So I actually want to talk about the humanities natural science split and why what seemed like fairly reasonable calls to get beyond this split have fallen on deaf ears in most parts of the humanities. So when we're talking about humanities natural science split, we're not talking about institutional things. So it's not just faculty of arts versus faculty of science. It's really about intellectual culture. So if you see piecemeal as two cultures, if you wish. So it's really, we're talking about core, what I call core humanities departments versus faculty of science and scientific-minded disciplines that are often housed in faculty of arts, like psychology is a good example at UBC is in the faculty of arts. And it would fall on the science side of things that I'm talking about. So a good way I found to figure out, are you a humanist? Which side of this line are you on? Is, did you read this book in grad school? How many people read this book in grad school? All right, so you're a humanist. It's a fairly good fast through. Yeah, sorry, maybe some of you have gone over to the dark side since. But if you read this in grad school, it's a good sign that you're probably on the humanist side of things. And that's because, Gertz's book is really a classic expression of, I think, the way most humanists at least understand the humanities natural science divide. And a good way to get at that is this use he puts Gilbert Ryle to. He quotes this passage from Ryle about these two boys. They both go like this. One of them is winking at an accomplice. One of them is just twitching. And Ryle says, from a film, if you took a film of this, there's no telling which contraction, if either, was a wink and which was a mere twitch. Yet there remains an immense but unphotographable difference between a twitch and a wink. That's my emphasis. So there's this, they're fundamentally different things. And what's the difference? It's the difference between, the way Ryle puts it, thick versus thin description. So thin description is just the physical reality of the scene, what can be captured by a film, what's going on. So it's what could be captured by a mechanical camera, as opposed to the thick meaning. So this is the human meaning of the scene. Gertz glosses this as the semiotic meaning of the scene. You can see the move Gertz is making toward linking this stuff up to crazy stuff in semiotics. But the basic idea, this is the human meaning, and it's immense but unphotographable. Why is that? The human/semiotic meaning is something completely separate from physical description. It can't be captured in physical description. And this is because human-level phenomena, thick phenomena, can only be grasped through interpretation. And hence the title of this book, Interpretation of Cultures. Cultures as thick human phenomena can only be grasped through interpretation. So the humanities natural science divide, understood this way, is about thick versus thin description. This is often what you'll get if you ask somebody what the difference is. They'll trot out these terms. Interpretation, understanding versus mechanistic explanation. This is a very common way it's characterized, I think. One of the things that I don't think is picked out as often, but is important to see, is that these modes of apprehension, these two different modes of understanding the world, are parasitic on something deeper, a deeper ontological picture, and that's mind-body dualism. And so that's not always recognized, and I think it's important to recognize because seeing that then makes a lot of other things make sense, especially about the kind of discomfort we have when we cross certain barriers. So the way in which humanities natural science maps onto mind-body dualism, like most things in life, is very much clearer in German. The language of thought, right? The humanities in German, the Geisteswissenschaften, right? The sciences or knowledges of the Geist. as opposed to the Naturwissenschaften. So what is this Geist? It's cognate with the English ghost, but it means mind. It can mean ghost, but it also means like mind, spirit, it can mean wit. But the Geist is special. It's a special type of thing. It's free, it's autonomous, it moves in ways that are not predictable from just physical principles. And the special thing, the really relevant thing about the Geist is because it's not physical, and it moves in these kind of mysterious ways, it can only be apprehended through interpretation or sympathetic understanding, a special type of understanding. And German being German, there's a special word for this, right? Verstehen. This is actually another good way to know if you're a humanist. If you don't speak German, but you know what verstehen means, you're a humanist, right? Most scientists are like, verstehen? What are you talking about? What is verstehen? This is a very important term of art in this gap. It basically, as far as I've ever been able to understand, involves a kind of direct Geist-to-Geist contact. So it's a special power that one Geist has to understand another Geist or the products of a Geist, which can be cultures, these kind of Übergeists, which are cultures. I always thought of it as kind of like the Vulcan mind melt. And it's not entirely facetious, actually, because it is like the Vulcan mind melt. It's mysterious. It can't be explained by physical principles. It's a special power that Geists have to understand other Geists. And you see this very clearly in another classic humanist, is Hans-Georg Gadamer. He talks about this fusion of horizons, or the Horizontverschmelzung, that happens in Verstehen. Verstehen is described by him as a fusion of horizons, and it really is a kind of opening up. He described it as an opening up of one Geist to another Geist. And actually, in Gadamer, it's got all these religious connotations, because it's ultimately the Geist you're opening yourself up to is God. But it's clearly it's something only Geists can do, and it's something only Geists do when they're interacting with other Geists, or Geist-like products. So the Geist is Wissenschaften, all this realm of interpretation is then contrasted with the Naturwissenschaften, the sciences that study the body, nature. They're concerned with things, the deterministic movement of these inert dumb objects, like billiard balls bouncing around. And these can be grasped through explanation, mechanistic explanation. Of course, there's a word for this in German too, right? Erklären. So it's a Verstehen versus Erklären. I think this is a good way to understand what's going on in self-conceptions of these different modes of explaining things. Verstehen versus Erklären, thick versus thin, free versus determined. The Geist is free, that's why it can't be explained mechanistically versus things that can be. And basically non-physical versus physical. So this is, you have to see how the modes of understanding thing, which is the usual explanation that's trotted out about the divide, is parasitic on a deeper kind of ontological picture. There being these two different types of stuff in the universe. Now mind-body dualism is not on the face of it implausible, I don't think. And I think until relatively recently, it was the best explanation we had for the world. And this is because minds do seem different from objects. Agents seem different from objects, right? There seems to be a different type of causality involved. Mental causation, willing things, desiring things seems to be fundamentally different from billiard balls bouncing into each other. And minds seem to display different kinds of abilities. Free choice, creativity, things you don't see in material processes. So they do seem, mind does seem fundamentally different from things. We also see what appear to be inarguable signs of design around us in the world. So we see evidence of intentionality everywhere. And we have a strong intuition that design requires intention, requires a mind. Paley walking across the heath, as one does in England, comes across the pocket watch. Somebody made this pocket watch. This is not, you don't just throw metal up in the air and have it come together and form a watch, right? Somebody built this watch. And we look at something like the retina, and we think there's got to be some kind of intentionality involved. Just the functionality seems so precisely designed, there's got to be a guiding intelligence behind it. It's very powerful intuition. So I say until recently, there's no convincing alternative. The one alternative that was out there, I mean, in theory, you could have triisms and quadisms, I guess. But the one main alternative has been monism. So kind of materialist monism. I guess you could have a mind monism too in certain systems. But one alternative has been a kind of materialism or physicalism, that there's nothing but stuff in the world. There's no such thing as mind. And this has been around for a long time. You find it way back in Lucretius and Rome. You've got arguably some pictures like this in early China. The problem with it is it seems like what Pat Churchman calls the boggled skeptic argument seems fatal for physicalism. And this is, she calls it the boggled skeptic argument. It's not really an argument, it's really more of a feeling. And it's just basically the propositional content is, huh? How could that be possible? It just seems inconceivable that any amount of stuff could ever give rise to mind, because they just strike us as so fundamentally different things. And it's such a powerful intuition that I think it's been impossible to override until quite recently. So what's changed? I think at least two things, and I don't have time to get into either one in detail, but I think developments in neo-Darwinian theory have finally decisively blocked the argument for design. And we've had, Darwinism's been around for a while. I happen to think that we don't really understand things until we get good metaphors for them. And so I think an important contribution has been people like Dawkins going, selfish gene, blind watchmaker, giving us metaphors that actually help us understand at a human level the way in which you get complex design through random processes, through mutations combined with selection pressure. So we now actually have a good story about how things that look like they have been designed could come about through non-intentional processes. And the second thing is developments in cognitive science that have demonstrated, some cases in the existence proofs with AI, where you have things we know that are machines doing mind-like things, or in the case of neuroscience, where we have some sense of how neurons are underlying mental processes. We have a demonstration of how mind can emerge from matter. So that I think in these two ways, the boggled skeptic has finally gotten her answer. So there's been physicalism or monism, I think, has become the most plausible empirical stance you could take on what the universe is like. So if the fundamental rationale for the humanities natural science split is mind-body dualism, and if this dualism is increasingly empirically untenable, then the distinction itself between the two modes of inquiry seems to be in trouble. And I think this is really the fundamental insight behind the call for vertical integration or consilience. It's that the divide between the two cultures is no longer empirically tenable. We should be able to understand the mind stuff using the same sort of principles we use to understand the other parts of the universe. And I think this is the basic position people like E.O. Wilson, Tooby Cosmides, and Steve Pinker have taken. The humanities, the mind level stuff, the Geist stuff, needs to plug itself into its proper place in this hierarchy of explanation. So right now, physical chemistry is grounded in physics, orgo is grounded in physical chemistry, all the way up to neuroscience, and then there's this gap. And people are very uncomfortable or reluctant to go over that line. And they're saying, let's basically just get rid of that line and plug human level. And of course, there's going to be a lot of levels here at the human level too. I've compressed it because of my PowerPoint slide size. But you've got the idea. We're going to have one unified chain of explanation without that ontological dividing line there anymore. And that's why I think the vertical integration metaphor is a good one, because it gets this idea of levels of explanation that are chained all the way down. It sounds reasonable. The problem is this humanists hate it. And I think this is an empirical way that we should do some surveys about your average humanist and what they feel about vertical integration. But I think this has been the idea of consilience or vertical integration is the only thing that unites humanists in universal revulsion. They agree about all sorts of other stuff, but you bring up E.O. Wilson or Steve Pinker, humanists love to hate Steve Pinker. I don't know what it is. He sets people off in a certain way in my field. So, and I'm a humanist, so I was trained. I read Garrett's. I know what first day means. I was trained as a humanist, and I know my colleagues in my home field and my day job really hate this stuff. And so it's an interesting question why. And it's especially interesting because even humanists who recognize that there's something wrong in the humanities really resist vertical integration. So in literary studies, there's been a lot of brouhaha about the crisis in literary studies, the crisis in the humanities. All these bigwigs have come out talking about how bad things are. So Bruno Latour, the humanities have run out of steam. Louis Menon, in this piece in MLA Profession, called the literary studies moribund. He said it's subject to this culture of conformity. We've got people kicking out, Derridian analyses of this and that, and it's getting really tired. What are we going to do next? And he said we could use some younger people who think the grown-ups got it all wrong. It's basically this is an interesting piece and it was very influential. And his position in it is something's really deeply wrong with literary studies. And we old people don't know what's going to happen next. What we need is some young Turks who are going to come shake things up and tell us old people what new direction we should take. And he says, I'm an old guy, I don't know what this new direction is. The only thing I know is it's not going to be consilience. Because I don't know anything except for that consilience is a bargain with the devil. So anything else but consilience is okay. Which is weird. So this guy knows his field's in trouble. He professes ignorance about what's going to come next, except he knows there's one thing that's very evil that we're not going to do. So this was the motivation for me writing this book as a humanist insider, because I think most of the people who have written about vertical integration have been people coming from the sciences or psychology. So I thought it'd be helpful for someone who is a native to address this problem from the other side of the divide. So what I'm going to be talking about is why the resistance. Where does it come from? And there are a variety of reasons, some good and some bad, and some I think important to address. So first of all, where's the resistance coming from? What do I mean by core humanities? We've got, I argue there are two identifiable positions that are resisting vertical integration. On the one side, you have objectivism, kind of old-fashioned Enlightenment objectivism. You find this mostly these days in philosophy, primarily philosophy and also in math, depending on what kind of linguistics people do in linguistics departments. So there's the idea, we study a priori structures of logical thought, so vertical integration isn't relevant because we study a priori stuff. It has nothing to do with empirical things in the body. They're opposed by this, what I call in the book postmodernism. All my colleagues say, oh, no one believes in postmodernism anymore. So I just spent a whole chapter demonstrating that, in fact, they all believe in postmodernism, the way I define it, which is strong social constructivism. The idea that linguistic, cultural forms go all the way down. We have no contact with reality outside of, we're basically imprisoned in these kind of social or linguistic discourses. So I have to spend a chapter proving that people still believe in this. And they do still believe in it, and this is most core humanities departments. So both of my home fields, Asian studies and religious studies, and certainly all the language departments, art history, depending on what kind of history department, you'll find it there. And these two positions are very much opposed to one another. Arguably, the second one is a reaction against the first one. But what I think is common to both of them is they're based on a kind of mind-body dualism. It's basically, I think, social constructivism, postmodernism is what you get when you're Kant, and then you lose faith in the universal aspects of thought. It's kind of objectivism gone bad. And the problem with both of them is they're based on this kind of mind-body problem. So one reason, so these are the two positions that resist vertical integration, and they ultimately do it because they're mind-body dualists. So one big reason for resistance would be that you're a mind-body ontological dualist. And these people do exist, and they come out of the closet and will admit to being a mind-body dualist. So we had a big conference at UBC back in September, and one of the people we invited was Rick Schrader, very important cultural anthropologist. And Rick's an out-of-the-closet Cartesian dualist. He says, I just think that the cogito argument can't be answered. Our immediate experience of consciousness is something totally different from the physical world, the way we understand the physical world. So he's a Cartesian dualist. And I think that if you are, then vertical integration doesn't make sense. If it is the case that there's actually a whole different substance in the world, Geist, consciousness, whatever you call it, that follows its own rules and is completely independent from the physical world, then it makes sense that you'd use two different ways to study the world. You'd have one for this Geist thing and one for the physical thing. So that's a good reason, I think, to resist vertical integration. The problem is I think it's very empirically impossible. I don't think mind-body dualism is defensible as an empirical position right now, although the jury's always out. And this is people like Searle always accuse physicalists of being dogmatic, and there are dogmatic physicalists. But you don't have to be. I mean, my position is it just doesn't seem very likely, but I'm open to being contradicted. In fact, I'm eager to be contradicted, because physicalism sucks. It's kind of depressing if you think it through. So I'd be happy to tell the truth that consciousness is an autonomous thing. And I have colleagues who work on this. I have a former colleague at UBC, very prominent social psychologist, whose main project now is to prove that there's a fifth dimension, which is consciousness. And I hope he proves this. He's a good scientist. He wants to get empirical evidence for this, but he hasn't proven it yet. And the fact that we want to believe this so much, we have so little evidence, suggests to me that it's kind of implausible. So there is one good reason, but right now I think it's ruled out by the kind of weight of empirical evidence. So one good but empirically implausible reason. There's also a bunch of bad reasons. One of them is just intellectual inertia. People get trained doing a certain thing and they don't want to change what they do. There's also this phenomenon I've been motivated to come up with an acronym for because I see it so much. It's sloppy conceptual free association, or SCIFA. And it's good because in Italian schifo means bad or disgusting. So it's an intellectually disgusting phenomenon. This kind of just people associate certain things with evolution or Darwinism and they then make a bunch of leaps. So humanists, they hear Darwinism and they often just have this kind of, it's an effective reaction to have. It really is kind of it's actually probably disgust-based reaction to Darwinism. So Darwinism evolution is immediately linked to social Darwinism. So it's immediately make this jump to social Darwinism. That's linked to Nazism. It's linked to eugenics, racism, white male dominance, right-wing libertarianism, unconstrained capitalism, WTO. Right? All things that right-thinking humanists hate. These are all things that we have discussed reactions to, are all linked together in one chain. Unless you think this is, I saw this scrawled on a bathroom wall or something. This is Hillary Rose and Stephen Miller. They make, in the course of a paragraph, they make these connections. So this is not just caffeine-addled adolescents. This is serious people. So this is a problem, but it's a bad reason, right? Sloppy conceptual free association needs to be short-circuited. When you see people doing this, you got to stop it. So that's a bad reason. There are reasonable concerns, I think, about applying evolutionary thinking to humans, and I was talking a little bit before my talk about this. And there are there are more reasonable voices out there. So I think Philip Kitcher, I'm not sure I totally agree with him, but at least he has a kind of defensible position about some of the reasons we might be concerned about applying evolutionary thinking to human beings. But I think burying our intellectual heads in the sand and having a disgust reaction to any mention of Darwinism is a kind of silly response. So this is a bad, SCIFA is a bad reason. There are also a bunch of relativistic epistemologies out there, linguistic and cultural constructivism that would say, well, we can't know anything. How can you say empirically implausible? Because what's empirical? Empirical is not any different from anything else. And these are they're problematic because they're theoretically incoherent and empirically indefensible. So I spent a whole chapter trying to debunk some of these ideas that are surprisingly common in the humanities, as Dan's recently discovered. You run into this constantly. So there's one good but empirically implausible reason. There are a bunch of bad reasons. But then there are some good reasons that require responses. That's what I'm going to spend most of my time on, talking about what I think are these good reasons that I think have not always adequately been responded to by defenders of vertical integration. So what are some of these good reasons? One is there are some problems with science. One of the weirdest features of the academy is that philosophy of science is done by humanists. It's almost never done by scientists. It's very weird. And most working scientists have an incredibly naive view of what science is. It's like nothing's happened since the 1920s in philosophy of science, right? So what are the problems with science? It's pretty clear theory and observation are intertwined inextricably. Theoretical presuppositions play an unavoidable role in what you perceive or do not perceive. We've got these schemas we're working with when we're looking at the world. So Kuhn, right, is one of the prominent people who's argued this. So the classical ideal, and by classic I mean the old-fashioned objectivist view of this purely objective observer and perfectly corroborated theory is unrealizable. You falsify a hypothesis. What did you falsify? Was it your hypothesis? Well, maybe, or maybe one of the millions of background assumptions that are back there. It's hard. You can't know for sure in an absolute 100% way. So there's the extreme overreaction to this is this crazy epistemological skepticism that you get in most areas of the humanities. So this typical thing, whenever I bring up scientific stuff at the AAR, the American Academy of Religion, you have people saying, well, after Kuhn, we know that science is just a discourse. None of these people have actually read Kuhn, but they know that Kuhn's proven that science is just a discourse. So empirical inquiry is no different in value or results from any other form of inquiry. And one form of integration that's actually been suggested by humanists is everything is a verstehen should swallow up everything. And actually Louis Mignon, in that piece at the end, he says, well, okay, here's one thing that might happen that I would support, is us going and showing those scientists that all they're doing is verstehen, with their fancy equipment and their lab coats. We're going to teach them that they're just doing the same thing we do. And then we'll teach them how to do interpretation right. So that's one way that everything, verstehen swallows up everything. And that's a silly position. The underreaction, though, is to ignore the issue. And so I think that it's problematic that people defending vertical integration often don't know much about philosophy of science. And if you don't know much, it's hard to defend empirical inquiry to this after Kuhn. People who actually haven't read the stuff but have heard what they want to hear from it. So I think what's necessary to defend vertical integration is a robust, theoretically defensible account of why empirical data is preferable to just sitting in your chair and making stuff up. And fortunately, there are good models like this. So you can turn to these post-objectivist, pragmatic models of science. I lay these out in chapter 5. People like Larry Loudon, Ian Hacking, Susan Hack have developed these post-objectivist models of, we're embodied, cognitively limited beings, but we're always in the world. How do we know the world? Because we are the world. We're bodies, we're interacting and getting feedback from the world all the time. So they get out of the skeptical circle of objectivism versus postmodernism by just rejecting mind-body dualism and restoring the importance of the empirical by emphasizing the fact that we're embodied beings. We're always in contact with and moving through the world in ways that are efficacious or not. And this is why empirical results matter. Okay? So you can defend science, but you need to have some story about it. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is just how you understand the role of culture in taking an evolutionary approach to human beings. The extreme view, of course, that people like Tooby Cosmides are reacting against is the idea that culture is entirely autonomous, it's sui generis. It's kind of a big Übergeist, right? It's subject only to its own laws, it has its own kind of way it evolves, and it's amenable, of course, only to Verstehen, because it's made out of that spooky stuff that Geist is made out of. I think a common overreaction in some early arguments in favor of consilience has been to overemphasize nativism. So to respond against this kind of extreme cultural constructivism by coming back to what might be an extreme nativist picture and reducing culture to kind of mechanically express phenotypic trait. And you see this, I think, in people like E.O. Wilson. There's one passage in sociobiology where it compares the human brain to an exposed negative waiting to be dipped into velvet or fluid. So basically, culture is just an evoked trait, right? This is evoked culture, right? It's there, the environment brings it out. The problem with this model is you've got no account of how cultural variation could arise or how cultures would change over time. And this is as humanists, this is what we do. This is our bread and butter. So if you're presenting a model where you've got no story about explaining what it is that we study, why would we listen to you? So this has been a problem, I think. The reasonable middle ground, I laid out in chapter 4. I'm going to go very fast here because people here have done this stuff. The model that innate human psychology is very complex. It's got a robust structure, so you've got a kind of strong nativism. You couple this but with a recognition that the structure can be reshaped and rechanneled in a whole variety of ways. And you've got a lot of different models for this, how you'd explain cultural variation. One model is cognitive linguistics, so the conceptual metaphor theory, the idea that people are drawing on embodied experience and using it to structure their abstract understanding of the world. But you could use different source domains. If you're talking about something like time or morality, you could be drawing on different source domains. Disgust as a metaphor, boundaries as a metaphor, accounting, the modern West using accounting as a metaphor. So this gives you some stories about how common embodied experience could give rise to very different cultural ideas. I think an even more powerful model is blending theory, conceptual blending theory, Fauconnier and Turner, which is arguing that, in fact, the way this usually works is that you've got a couple domains projecting into a new domain selectively, and this blend has emergent structure. And the power of this is that it shows how you get new things. With conceptual metaphor theory, you're just taking something like a journey and using it to talk about life. The structure doesn't change. In blending theory, you talk about how you can take two source domains and blend them into a third domain that's got new emergent structure. It's a new structure that didn't exist before. And then that structure, so this novel structure, can get entrenched in language or built into the physical environment and become an input to new blends. And so you get a couple steps away from common embodied common sense, I think. I propose a theory that you can only go 3 ratchets before it's hard to understand, but I have no data for that. It's just my feeling. It probably is the case that once you get far enough away from common sense, you lose the ability to understand what's going on. And that's possibly the case in certain parts of science, like string theory, like this, where we know the math works, but we can't picture it, probably because it's too many steps away from common sense. So that's one approach, is this kind of cognitive linguistics approach. Another approach is the mind culture, gene culture co-evolution approach, saying that look, there's dual inheritance, right? There's 2 streams going on here. So culture is a semi-autonomous force. It's part of your adaptive environment. It's carried and filtered by individual minds, so you've got filtering going on by the minds that are carrying this stuff. And it's also capable of exerting an independent force on these minds. And it's got its own history, right? It's got its own separate evolutionary history, Boyd Richardson stuff. It's subject to its own sort of constraints. And it's going to be having a feedback effect on genetic evolution. The classic example being lactose tolerance, right? You get livestock herding, you don't have yogurt or cheese culture, and lactose tolerance can develop. We know what gene mutates, so it's a cultural technology having a feedback on genes. So these two are, there's dual inheritance, right? We have two streams of information being passed down, and the two can interact. Now you have a story about how cultures can change and how cultural variation could arise. So I think there are good vertically integrated stories about culture, but some advocates of vertical integration haven't been pushing the culture side of things enough. Another important issue to address is the status of humanistic inquiry. So where that stuff above the line fits in once you plug it into the levels below. It's pretty clear that human level truths, so you talk about human level concepts, intentionality, beauty, honor, dignity, have to have their own emergent structure in a chain of vertical integration. So there's new structure happening at these levels. And this is no different from any other level, right? Organic chemistry has its own emergent structure. There's new things going on in organic chemistry, and it's constrained by physical chemistry, but it's not entirely predictable from, and this is really important, it's not entirely heuristically reducible to the lower level. And this is why we have people who are organic chemists, and they're different from people who do physical chemistry, right? They maybe know a lot about physical chemistry, but there's new things going on at this new level of explanation. And humanists then study their own emergent level truths, human level truths, and there's no need, sometimes, at least the way they hear it called for vertical integration, is sometimes the idea that, okay, well, we're going to give up studying literature and stuff, and we're all going to become evolutionary biologists. And that's silly. In the same way, we're going to give up organic chemistry, and we're all going to become physical chemists or physicists, right? We'll get rid of all departments in the university and just have a physics department. Right? That's silly. Humanists are going to continue to study human-level truths. And I think for most of them, 90% of what they do when they're doing their day job, when they're doing their specialized work, is going to be unchanged by vertical integration. You have people who study the details of coalition formation in medieval Japan, and they're studying the way poetry forms are markers of coalition adherence and what the history of these poetic forms are. A lot of what they're doing, evolution is going to tell them nothing about it. What is important, where vertical integration would be important, is what happens when they frame their specific detailed historical study in a larger framework. Often, right now, they fall back to these kind of crazy stories they're getting from Foucault, whatever they read in grad school. But so when they want to frame it in a larger, this is when humanists, the other thing that's not recognized as humanists, when we do our work, we're very empirical. We need evidence, right? We look at historical evidence, we look at linguistic evidence. We're very good scientists when we do our specific work. The problem has been when we pan out and try to talk about bigger issues where we don't have direct evidence, then we start making things up. But we do very good work, and that's not going to change, right? Historical linguistic work is not going to change. What might change is the framing. So that's important to make that clear to humanists, that we're not trying to eliminate humanities departments, and they're still going to keep doing what they do. Another important thing to emphasize is just the bidirectionality of integration. So explanation in a vertically integrated chain of explanation, you've got explanation flowing in both ways, up and down the chain, right? And it's often we emphasize the downward one, and maybe that's the more important one. But explanation, or the fact that the lower ones are constraining the higher ones, but explanation can go both ways. A good example of that is the debate between Darwin and the future Lord Kelvin about the age of the Earth. This was actually brought up at our conference on vertical integration by someone who was very opposed to vertical integration. And he brought this example up as an example of how even the sciences aren't vertically integrated. So this debate was basically, for evolution to work, the Earth had to be a certain age. Kelvin said there's no way the Earth is that old. It would have died a heat death a long time ago. So they had different opinions about how old the Earth was. So this guy who brought this up said, see, even biology and physical geology is not integrated. I think what he missed is that they didn't just throw up their hands and go, we study incommensurable realms. they weren't happy until they figured out who was right and who was wrong. And it turns out Darwin was right. So Kelvin, so Darwin's need for the Earth to be older, coming out of evolutionary biology, actually caused physical geology physicists to examine new things. They discovered radioactivity and other things they weren't taking account of. So it's a good example of the higher level in the chain actually being right and forcing the lower level to look at new things that they hadn't looked at before. And actually recently I was giving a talk on this at Wellington, Victoria University of Wellington, and someone in the psychology department said she feels that conceptual metaphor theories have the same effect on psychology. So psychologists have started looking at metaphor in a whole different way now because of Lakoff and Johnson's work, which was done at a kind of broader level of generality. So you have people discovering something up here that makes people at lower levels rethink the way they were studying a particular phenomenon. So explanation can go both ways. And humanistic understanding is also, we have to recognize, very important for understanding human level stuff, both in terms of the data we can provide as humanists and also conceptualization. So the first one sometimes recognized, but I think the second one not as much. So data, the data side of things, if you think about if this is all of human experience, a lot of the vertically integrated work on human beings looks at that, this little tiny top of the triangle, right? And actually, really, what they look at is usually just the sample at the very top that my colleagues at UBC have recently called the weird sample, the weirdest people in the world, right? It's coming out in BBS any day now. Henrik, Norenstein, and Heine. Basically, most psychological studies are based on university undergrads. And university undergrads are the weirdest subgroup of an already extremely weird group of North Americans that has ever lived. So we're basing all this stuff on this weird, tiny perspective data. Humanists can give you guys access to the rest of this pyramid. So that's the data side of things. But also it's important to realize conceptualization, when you're studying human level things, the way you formulate your categories requires humanistic expertise. Just one example with this data thing, humanists study this, and we've known for a long time that that's weird. Studying university undergraduates, I remember going home when I talked to these guys about their piece, and I told my wife, who studies medieval Japanese poetry, yeah, Joe and R and Steve, they got this piece, we're going to tell psychologists that college students are not a very good representative sample of humanity, and my wife's reaction was, duh. Why didn't they just ask us, right? We knew this. So it's, we have an understanding of human history and human culture that can help contextualize the kind of studies a lot of psychologists are doing. Also, the way you formulate categories. We've got people studying the psychology of religion or the evolution of religion who have no training in religious studies at all. And their lack of conceptual sophistication about just what religion is, how you formulate the category of religion, leads to some really deep problems with their empirical work. So for instance, if you want to do a study, just to randomly take an example of the effect of religious versus secular crimes on cooperative behavior and economic gains, you have to know what we mean by a religious crime. And I can think of a particular study by a very good friend of mine that had some really wacky religious crimes that were very culturally specific. And it's because without training in religious studies, psychologists fall back on kind of what a randomly asked undergraduate on the street would tell you religion is, which is usually some kind of watered down form of Protestantism, not terribly representative, especially if your subjects are mostly Chinese kids, which at UBC they are. So you want to get at religious versus secular stuff, you got to know what religion is, right? And religious scholars have thought about this for a long time, and we've come up with some ideas that might be helpful. So religious scholars are more than just glorified RAs. And David Sloan Wilson has, I forget if it's in Darwin's Cathedral or Evolution for Everyone, but he compares human, in this case religion scholars, to pre-Darwinian naturalists. So we're kind of out there collecting butterflies and we don't really know what to do with them. They're organized by color or by how pretty they are. And then Darwin comes along and tells us what it all means, right? And that's his model for what he's going to do for religion. Is that, okay, you guys collecting all this data, and I'm going to come tell you what your data means. And there's something to that. I mean, the evolutionary framework gives you an organizing framework that's incredibly powerful and makes you look at things in a new way and ask new questions. But to understand what religion even is, you need people, humanists in at the ground floor, coming up with the concepts and not just being out there gathering data for you. So this needs to be recognized by defenders of vertical integration. Also, we have very deep, if you want to call it thick, we have very thick cultural knowledge, and this is important as well. And I see, when I look, I hang out mostly with psychologists now, And I'm just horrified by some of the things they do. So they do these cross-cultural studies where they just have this incredibly disturbing lack of concern about problems of translation or cultural histories. So they want to study religion, and they ask people, well, what religion do you belong to? And they don't, because they come from, they're using this Judean-Christian model where you belong to, you're a Protestant or you're a Lutheran or something else. But they're studying cultures where affiliation is very fluid. Am I a Taoist? Yes, yeah, I'm a Taoist. Why? I'm also I also do this Confucian stuff, right? In most cultures, there's not the same kind of religious affiliation, sharp boundaries that you have in Judeo-Christian cultures. And this is not recognized, and this skews their data in important ways because they're putting people in these boxes. Those boxes don't exist in that culture. Or studying, to pick on another one of my colleagues, studying pride, and they're trying to do it cross-culturally. And what's the word for pride in your language? And the really shocking thing I find is that you look at a lot of these surveys, especially cross-cultural survey results, and in the methods section, they tell you all about their statistics and all about this other stuff. They never give you the translation of the survey into the target language. And when I ask them, well, how did you translate this stuff? They always say, oh, I don't know, we had some RA do it. As if it's just a completely unproblematic process to get somebody to translate one word into another. There's going to be some correlate there. And there's often not. So this needs to be recognized too. And this is where you need the kind of linguistic, cultural expertise that humans have. So finally, I want to talk about the last thing is the status of human level truth. As I mentioned, these human level concepts have their own emergent structure and a chain of vertical integration. That's important to recognize. What's also important to recognize is because they have emergent structure and we're built to think in these terms, they're real for us. For human beings, human level concepts are real. And I think the person who's really laid this out the most forcefully is Charles Taylor in Sources of the Self. Human level concepts are real for human beings. The extreme response, and unfortunately I think Taylor goes to that extreme, is ontological emergentism. So you have these emergent level realities, and because they seem real to us, they've got to be real. So they're actually ontologically true. So human level truths constitute their own ontological realm. You've got Taylor saying basically because these things are real for us, they're as real as anything studied by physics. They're just real with a capital R. You have people like John Searle talking about original intentionality. I think he's more recently dropped the capital letters to make it look less spooky, but the concept is as spooky as ever. It's emergent in a very strong way. It's a whole different ontological realm. So I think that's the extreme response to emergence. It's making a mistake, mistaking heuristic emergence for ontological emergence. But the extreme counter-response has been a kind of eliminative reductionism, where you don't give proper due to these emergent level realities. So arguing, for instance, that human-level concepts, human-level truths are just perceptual illusions, and invoking this kind of Copernican analogy. So we used to believe these things, but now we know, intentionality is not really what we thought it was, so we'll just stop using these terms. We'll just get rid of them and start talking about neurons instead. And people like Paul Churchland talk like this, and even people like Owen Flanagan and Dan Dennett in certain moments talk this way. But the point is, if we're built to experience these things, they're not going to go away just because we know they're not true in some way. So I think the middle ground, I try to lay this out in the last chapter, is what I call dual consciousness, where you realize that human level truths, human level concepts are inescapable for psychologically normal people. As long as you're a psychologically normal human being, things like morality, good, bad, intentionality, things like this are going to be real for you and inescapably real for you. And this is why the Copernican analogy is not a very good one. We don't have a built-in Ptolemaic module. We do have some built-in things that are part of our factory issue defaults, like theory of mind. We do have some kind of folk dualism or theory of mind built in. We do have moral and familial emotions built in. And knowing the ultimate explanations for these things are not going to make the actual proximate things go away anytime soon. And that's got to be recognized, and not just recognized, because I think it is recognized, but it also has to be emphasized by people who are defending vertical integration. But at the same time, resisting that move into giving them special ontological status. Because qua scientists, we can see how they reduce ontologically, if not heuristically, to lower levels. So I think conceptually, it's a tricky kind of thing. You're looking at things through two different lenses. So parental love is a great example of this. This is my daughter, super cute. If you're a psychologically normal human being, you find her cute. There's something wrong with you if you don't. I love her intensely. I do crazy things for her. The only intellectually satisfying explanation I've ever had for that is Hamilton's rule. Right? This is why you find her. This is why you find her cute through this bleed over effect, right? She cues all the things that you get from your own kid. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. And yet, why do I love my daughter? Because look at her. She's so cute, right? So this is the case with any of these type of built-in things. Anything involving ultimate and proximate explanation, the majority of these human-level realities for us have this kind of inescapable forced approximate level, and they have to. They wouldn't work if you could opt out of them. Evolution would have done a bad job if it was kind of optional for me to love my daughter or not. And this has an important, I think, sometimes not recognized implications for the chain of vertical integration. The fact that human-level stuff feels different to us at a really deep affective level means that this move, when we move from human level stuff and we cross over to neuroscience, there's always going to be a little speed bump there. And I think a really qualitatively different way than moving from, say, organic chemistry to physical chemistry. Because crossing this line, we're crossing mind-body dualism, which is something that's built into us. So mind-body dualism, I think, is empirically implausible, but we're also designed not to find it implausible at a kind of phenomenological level. So I think whenever we cross this line, people are going to get a little swirly. People are going to get a little uncomfortable. And this suggests that there are some real limits to vertical integration in the sense that our innate folk dualism and our innate, these proximate emotions we have, mean that we're always going to see people as different from objects. Again, as long as we're not psychopaths, right, or very severely autistic, we're going to see people as different from objects. And that means that the humanities-science divide is always going to have some traction in human psychology. There's always going to be some fraught tension in moving over that line that's different from the lines within the physical sciences. It's also the reason we feel much more comfortable applying evolution to our bodies. But as soon as we start talking about any kind of mind stuff in evolution, everyone gets all upset. We're fine talking about our spleen, but we worry about talking about intelligence or creativity or personality using evolution. So that's important to see, and I think, so I've actually, a new volume coming out has moved to coin this term, second wave consilience, which it's hard to come up with a term that doesn't sound obnoxious. We're the second wave. But I want to mark it off in some way in the sense that marks a rebound from the swing I think you saw in the early days toward extreme nativism, and it's just about the Pleistocene brain running around a modern environment, toward a form of consilience that does respond to these good concerns about the original formulations. And actually doesn't only respond to them, but emphasizes the way in which vertical integration properly understood can accommodate all these concerns and accommodate them in a satisfying way. So I think the Beck group here is a great example of people doing this kind of stuff. Our new center up at UBC is trying to do this kind of stuff. And if you're interested in publications that are in this new wave, second wave, if you want to call it that, I think the Carruthers, Lawrence, and Stitch volumes are representative examples. And we have a conference volume coming out probably next year that I think has representative examples of people embracing this second wave of consilience. So vertical integration understood this way. This is the cover image for the book, and I liked it because you got the two realms, and they're overlapping, and they're always going to feel like two realms to us. So there are two circles that are intersecting. But properly understood, humanists study all these little leaves out here, all the details of these leaves out of the end of the tree of knowledge. And it can be a positive thing for us. This is what I have to argue to my colleagues, to understand that those leaves are attached to branches, and those are attached to a trunk. It's all grounded in the earth. And understanding how this stuff down here is working is going to inform and enrich our understanding of these wonderful different shaped leaves that we study. So vertical integration doesn't have to be scary for humanists, but there's also an onus on people coming from the other side to recognize the ways in which humanists are worried about vertical integration and some of the perfectly valid concerns they have about it. Okay, thanks.